The voice of women, the voice of women, 91.7.
Welcome to The Big Question on Women Radio, WFM 91.7. The Big Question, where we discuss and profile solutions to issues affecting us as a nation and as citizens. The COVID-19 pandemic is obviously causing untold human suffering and has heightened gender inequalities around the world, Nigeria inclusive, with profound shock to our societies and economies. And so this has called for immediate action by relevant stakeholders to consider and demand greater women representation to address COVID-19. In view of this, UN Women is working with partners to bridge the gender data gap and obviously deliver accurate representation of the gender dimension to COVID-19 response to be more effective for women and girls. And this morning, we are delighted to have with us on Women Radio over the telephone, UN Women Country Representative to Nigeria and ECOWAS, Comfort Lamptey. Hi, Comfort.
Good morning. Good morning, Tom. How are you? And good morning to all your listeners, too.
I'm trying to keep safe. And you, how are you doing?
We're in the same boat. We're all trying to keep safe and do whatever we can in our different ways to try to ensure that the impact of this crisis on ordinary men and women in this country and indeed globally for the UN can be minimized, the negative impact that is.
Can you highlight the contribution of UN Women Nigeria and ECOWAS in terms of awareness and preventive measures when it comes to women and girls during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Okay, thank you, Ton. Maybe I'll start by highlighting the UN in Nigeria's approach, because I think that at the very outset of the crisis, as a UN family, we came together and agreed that the impact of our interventions will be greater if we join hands and actually support the government of Nigeria as one UN. And one of the very first things that the UN did was to look at individual contributions that all of our agencies could make to support the government at the very outset to procure some of the equipment that was necessary to support the crisis. So largely medical equipment, test kits, and personal protection equipment, and so on. So basically, the most immediate health requirements that the government has. So we all joined forces to support that, and the first shipment for that actually arrived last week in Abuja. We've also, as a UN, provided important technical support to the government. A couple of weeks back, UN Women, on behalf of the UN, actually designed a guidance note to support members of the Presidential Task Force and other partners to look at how issues of gender can be addressed in the 10 priority areas of the government's multi-sectoral response plan on the pandemic. We've also tried to support educating different stakeholders about the gender dimension. So UN Women also issued a gender brief on why this COVID-19 pandemic is relevant for women and what are the gender implications of the crisis. So we've done that, and of course our work, our main government counterpart is the Ministry of Women's Affairs, and so we've also reached out to the Ministry of Women's Affairs. The ministry has been very proactive, as you know, and has actually issued a whole series of education, materials, jingles, and so on. We've joined forces to support them to expand this and to amplify the education targeting communities, women and girls. And so we also working with the ministry to support some of the efforts that they are making. And then we've also been working with our partners, particularly also partners that are working to provide services to women and girls who have experienced violence. And as we know, domestic violence has been on the increase since this crisis took hold. And so we have been supporting efforts to negotiate the ability to move around, first of all, to ensure that the authorities uphold provision of services, gender-based violence services as essential services, and then facilitating the ability of some of our partners in Lagos and Sokoto in particular to move around and provide services to affected victims. And so those are some of the measures that we're doing initially, and we have we hope to continue to intensify some of the support going forward.
Thank you very much, Comfort. I'm glad to hear what you're doing in Sokoto as well, because I think the very first case was publicized in Sokoto 2 days ago, and it's also good to hear that you're working with the different stakeholders on the gender dimension on why COVID-19 pandemic and the gender implications. I'm glad to know that you're working with the Ministry of Women Affairs on this. This is the big question on Women Radio 91.7, and I'm talking to Comfort Lamptey, the UN Women Country Representative to Nigeria and ECOWAS. So, Comfort, one of your key areas is preventive violence against women and girls. Now, we have on record that there's a 6 to 7% increase in gender-based violence in Abuja and Lagos states alone, according to WARIF. This is a big threat to the female gender. What measures is UN Women putting in place?
Yes, indeed, the issue of gender-based violence, sadly, in this crisis, as we've seen in many crises, in many situations of social upheaval and crisis, tends to go up, and sadly, we are seeing that is the case in Nigeria as well. And some of the partners have provided the data to show. Last week we also received data from across 22 states, which actually shows that within the first 2 weeks of the lockdown, the number of incidences of domestic violence and gender-based violence has actually increased. What we are doing, as you know, the UN is supporting a program in partnership with the European Union called the UN-EU Spotlight Initiative. This program is operational in 6 states of Nigeria, and part of the program activities involve supporting centers and one-stop centers, the operation of one-stop centers that provide support to victims of gender-based violence. And so in the context of the crisis, what we are doing is really giving strong support to these centers, as I mentioned earlier, in Lagos, the Mirabel Center in Lagos and the Nana Khadija Center in Sokoto. We're trying to ensure that they can provide a whole range of services to those who are most affected. UN Women is also under the same Spotlight initiative, oversees the support for women's organizations, and so we have a number of partner organizations across the country that we're supporting and who have also come together to support the awareness raising around the issues of increased gender-based violence. So a lot of the public awareness. And even the public awareness we're doing with the Ministry of Women's Affairs is also highlighting the issues of gender-based violence. We're also supporting some of the partners collaborating with some of the partners that are providing psychosocial support because, as we know, the periods of lockdown also had severe psychological impact on people, and sometimes the manifestation of that is the violence. And so, whether you're victim of the violence, acts of violence, or actually suffering from mental health as a result of this, we're also collaborating with some of the partners that are supporting this, and then also trying to address the issue of male engagement and advocacy activities that target men in this regard. Globally, UN Women launched the He for She at Home campaign, and we're really working now to see how we can launch that in Nigeria, which is targeting men and really appealing to men during this period at home, not only to support women to address the additional burden of home care, but also to refrain from acts of violence against women, and appealing to male role models who actually amplify that message. So from the point of view of service provision, from the point of view of working with the states to also bring together the data on incidences, because the data will also facilitate better interventions. And then working with men. Those are some of the ways in which we're trying to address the issue of gender-based violence during this period.
Difficult times for women and girls. This is Women Radio, The Big Question, today Wednesday, April 22, 2020. And we're talking to Comfort Lamptey, the UN Women Representative Nigeria and ECOWAS. Comfort, I read somewhere where UN Women said women make up 70% of the health workforce globally. Nigeria, we have more women in the workforce in Nigeria as well. And we know women are largely affected when it comes to poor health care services, which Nigeria, again, we know is struggling with. How can the United Nations help influence a national response to address the impact of COVID-19 on women's health in this side of the world?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, because we have seen from other pandemics that have happened that in other parts of the world, that in situations such as this, there is a sense in which the priority, the health priority, tends to shift to addressing the pandemic, and then sometimes that's at the expense of women's health, women's sexual and reproductive health in particular, as well as investments in pre- and postnatal support. And so one of the important advocacy that UN Women has been making globally is that even whilst we put our all attention, rightly so, to addressing the COVID-19 pandemic, we should not do so at the expense of women's health. And that, services for women, for women's reproductive health, for women's pre- and postnatal healthcare services should continue, and also services to address gender-based violence. So in other words, the investments in women's health should not be traded off in our efforts to address the pandemic. So that's one key advocacy point that UN Women has been making. The second is also the women in the front line themselves. I mean, this particular pandemic, if we want to draw the analogy to a war situation, the army in this case are the health workers, the frontline workers, and actually the statistic of the 70% representation is a WHO statistic that over 70% of the healthcare workers around the globe tend to be women. And so it's important that we support them to be able to deliver the services and the support that they are providing to the general public. And so really ensuring that frontline workers are protected is important. And we've also been promoting that. Now, the other aspect of women's health is access to information. And we know that generally in our part of the world, women tend to be less educated than men, and often have less access to information than men. And women need information in order to be able to take decisions about their health that can protect them and their families in this in addressing this virus. And so ensuring that public health messages and public education messages are framed to be digested or to be able to be accessed by women and understood by women and targeted to women is also another important message that UN Women has also been underlining. And then, of course, the issue of ensuring services that respond to increased rise of domestic violence. So addressing all of those services, making sure that there are enough shelters, there are enough service providers who can respond to some of the emerging health concerns of women directly as a result of the crisis. In this case, as I said earlier, incidences of domestic violence rising, gender-based violence more broadly as well. So those are some of the, I think, important ways in which we are also advocating for getting better information to women, protecting women who are in the front line, safeguarding investments in women's health needs, and then addressing issues of GBV in the context of the crisis, so that we can ensure that women's health needs are not compromised. But I think at the end of the day, if there's anything also that we should learn more broadly about this crisis, is that in Africa, in Nigeria, we really do need to invest massively in the quality and standards of healthcare provisions that we provide to the general public, period. And so in that sense, this is also an opportunity for us to look more closely at the level of investments that we're making in women's health, and saying, once this crisis is over, as part of the recovery process, what are we going to do and how are we going to improve on the health systems that we have in our country? And in doing so, how do we also ensure that we invest more meaningfully in services that respond to women's specific health needs?
The economic recovery measures under, I think, the UN policy says that everything we do during and after the COVID-19 must aim to build a more equal, inclusive, and sustainable economy and a society. Now, I live in Nigeria, I'm Nigerian, and I know that this economy, this society is not one of that includes women that much. So how feasible can Nigeria achieve this, even after COVID-19?
First of all, I think it is feasible. We have to believe that it's feasible. We need the commitment, we need the political will to build that more inclusive economic agenda. I would like to see this crisis, embedded in every crisis is also an opportunity, because once you deal with the immediate consequences or fallout of the crisis, you also now have to pick up the pieces and say, okay, how do you reshape society? And therein lies the opportunity, because we have an opportunity after this crisis, which is actually having a devastating impact on most economies around the world. I don't think there's any single economy that is or will be spared, and particularly so for Nigeria as an oil producing economy that has been over reliant on oil, and we've seen what is happening in terms of oil prices in the last few days, and so the economic fallout will be huge. And we also have an economy where most people are operating from the informal sector. And for women in employment, over 85% of women in the employment, in the workforce are actually in the informal sector. And this is the most vulnerable sector as well in this crisis. So the impact on women is huge. But in order for our countries to be able to recover, we have to be able to draw on the contribution of everyone. The small and medium-sized enterprises that are run by women, and in Nigeria, almost half of these enterprises are women-led enterprises. How can we not look at women's economic empowerment in the context of reshaping the Nigerian economy? And so, for me, the opportunity lies in looking at how we can support an economic system that actually is more inclusive, and that we can also invest in social protection systems that can also ensure that women have the right kind of protection against these social shocks. We saw in the Ebola crisis in West Africa and Liberia and Sierra Leone that actually, women owned enterprises actually struggled to recover recovered much more slowly than enterprises that are led by men. We should take the lessons from that as well. But I do see this as an opportunity for us to look at how we can also build more inclusive economic systems and ensure better protection for those who are in the informal sector as we think through the recovery process.
I've been talking to Comfort Lamptey. My name is Tolu Kiwale Shonaya, and this is The Big Question on Women Radio. I'm just quickly going to wrap, see if I can just ask another question. Now, how can we, as a nation, I'm talking about Nigeria now, and obviously you're one of us, how can we as a nation and individuals address gender inequality to move Nigeria and Africa forward?
Yeah, well, this is the challenge for us all, because this crisis has exacerbated or has exposed some of the inequalities in our society. As I said, for me, every crisis should be we should look at the opportunities in there to correct it. I believe that we need a number of things. We have all the tools. Here in Nigeria, I do believe that if we want to look at what has worked, and when we're looking at global best practices in really working, although we know that no country has achieved gender equality, But what helps along that journey is ensuring that we have legislation in place. And I think that in Nigeria we do need to look at investing in legislation that can provide those guarantees of representation, guarantees of participation, guarantees of women's economic rights, and all the rights that at the global level Nigeria has signed on to. We need to make sure that at the national level those are translated into policy. So having a strong legislation in place, I believe, is important, and we need to strengthen the institutional mechanisms, strengthen the Ministry of Women's Affairs, and strengthen women's rights organizations to do this work as well.
Strengthening the women ministry, strengthening our legislation, those are two key things I'm taking away from you. And the last question I call for is, the world knows, we all know that policies that fail to consult women or include women in decision making, they're less effective. So what is your role, or how can the UN intervene to ensure an inclusive representation to address COVID-19 in Nigeria and across Africa? And at the same time, just, what would be your final thoughts to Nigerian women or African women during this lockdown?
Yeah, so I think one of our comparative advantages of the UN in our development context is really providing the technical advisory services to government, and that's where we can also support the government to ensure that in the kind of policies that are being designed for the long-term recovery, that they are designed and implemented with a gender lens. So whether we're looking at the agricultural sector, we're looking at the health sector, we're looking at the economic sector, all the sectors that the UN will be providing technical advisory services to have to address gender concerns. And so we'll continue to do that, and we'll continue to share global best practices with the government of Nigeria. And of course, the final word is to also ask all Nigerian women to firstly to acknowledge and salute all Nigerians, and particularly Nigerian women, for really being able to withstand this crisis and hold their homes and communities together in these very trying times. And I think it's important messages that we need to continue to stand in solidarity with the thousands of women who are on the front line, whether as health workers or working in the supermarket, doing all the keeping the cleanliness around our communities and environment. Really acknowledge and stand in solidarity, and then that we also have to stand in solidarity and speak out against those who are being violated, whose rights are being violated, who are suffering violence in the homes during this particular period of the crisis. So women standing in solidarity is the key.
Indeed, for gender equality and inclusion is paramount for any society to be sustainable. And we know that to end the spread of COVID-19, its impact should be viewed with gender lens to aid synergy between governments at all levels and women. Thank you very much, Comfort Lamptey. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me on your program too, and have a good day.
You too, have a good day and stay safe.
Stay safe too. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. So special thanks to UN Women Country Representative to Nigeria and ECOWAS, Comfort Lamptey, for being part of the Big Question on Women Radio.
WFM 91.7.